All right, third graders, I'm going to keep going from our read aloud holes, but before I do that, I want us to focus on really be thinking in detail about story structure, characters, but we can go beyond that. Tell me their traits, about their personality. Think about all the different settings. What's happening? Is there a problem so far that we can kind of think of? So keep that in mind since that's our skill of the week. And again, we're on page 36. After leaving Mira's house, Eli wandered aimlessly through the town until he found himself down by the wharf. He sat on the edge of a pier and stared down into the cold, black water. He could not understand how Mira had trouble deciding between him and Igor. He thought she loved him. What if she didn't love him? Couldn't she see what a foul person Igor was? It was like Madame Zeroni had said. Her head was as empty as a flower pot. Some men were gathering on another dock, and he went to see what was going on. A sign read, "Deckhands wanted, free passage to America." He had no sailing experience, but the ship's captain signed him aboard. The captain could see that Eli was a man of great strength. Not everybody could carry a full-grown pig up the side of a mountain. It wasn't until the ship had cleared the harbor and was heading out across the Atlantic that he suddenly remembered his promise to carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain. He felt terrible. He wasn't afraid of the curse. He thought that was a lot of nonsense. He felt bad because he knew Madame Zeroni had wanted to drink from the stream before she died. So now it's going back. Zero was the smallest kid in Group D, but he was the first one to finish digging. "You're finished," Stanley asked enviously. Zero said nothing. Stanley walked to Zero's hole and watched him measure it with his shovel. The top of his hole was a perfect circle, and the sides were smooth and steep. Not one dirt clod more than necessary had been removed from the earth. Zero pulled himself up to the surface. He didn't even smile. He looked down at his perfectly dug hole, spat in it, and then turned and headed back to the camp compound. "Zero's one weird dude," said Zigzag. Stanley would have laughed, but he didn't have the strength. Zigzag had to be the weirdest dude Stanley had ever seen. He had a long, skinny neck and a big round head with wild, frizzy blonde hair that stuck out in all directions. His head seemed to bob up and down on his neck like it was on a spring. Armpit was the second one to finish digging. He also spat his hole before heading back to the camp compound. One by one, Stanley watched each of the boys spit into his hole and return to the camp compound. Stanley kept digging. His hole was almost up to his shoulders, although it was hard to tell exactly where ground level was because his dirt piles completely surrounded the hole. The deeper he got, the harder it was to raise the dirt up and out of the hole. Once again, he realized he was going to have to move the piles. His cap was stained with blood from his hands. He felt like he was digging his own grave. In America, Eli learned to speak English. He fell in love with a woman named Sarah Miller. She could push a plow, milk a goat, and most important, think for herself. She and Eli often stayed up half the night talking and laughing together. Their life was not easy. Eli worked hard, but it had luck seemed to follow him everywhere. He always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He remembered Madame Zeroni telling him that she had a son in America. Eli was forever looking for him. He'd walk up to complete strangers and ask if they knew someone from Zeroni or had ever heard of anyone named Zeroni. No one did. Eli wasn't sure what he'd do if he ever found Madame Zeroni's son anyway. Carry him up a mountain and sing the pig lullaby to him. After his barn was struck by lightning for the third time, he told Sarah about his broken promise to Madame Zeroni. "I'm worse than a pig thief," he said. "You should leave me and find someone who isn't cursed." "I'm not leaving you," said Sarah, "but I want you to do one thing for me." "Anything," said Eli. Sarah smiled. "Sing me the pig lullaby." He sang it for her. Her eyes sparkled. "She's so pretty. What does it mean?" Eli tried his best to translate it from Latvian into English, but it wasn't the same. "It rhymes in Latvian," he told her. "I could tell," said Sarah. A year later, their child was born. Sarah was named Stanley because she noticed that Stanley was Yelnats spelled backwards. Sarah changed the words of the pig lullaby so that they rhymed, and every night she sang it to Stanley. If only the woodpecker sighs, the bark on the tree was as soft as the skies, while the wolf waits below, hungry and lonely, crying to the moon, 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 if only, if only. Now it switches back. Stanley's hole was as deep as a shovel, but not quite wide enough on the bottom. He grimaced as he sliced off a chunk of dirt, then raised it up and flung it into a pile. He laid his shovel back down in the bottom of his hole, and to his surprise, it fit. He rotated it and only had to chip off a few chunks of dirt here and there before it could lie flat across his hole in every direction. He heard the water truck approaching. He felt a strange sense of pride as being able to show Mr. Sir and Mr. Podolsky that he had dug his hole first. He put his hands on the rim and tried to pull himself up. He couldn't do it. His arms were too weak to lift his heavy body. He used his legs to help, but he just didn't have any strength. He was trapped in his hole. It was almost funny, but he wasn't in the mood to laugh. "Stanley," he heard Mr. Podolsky call. Using his shovel, he dug 2 footholes in the hole wall. He climbed out to see Mr. Podolsky walking over to him. "I was afraid you fainted," Mr. Podolsky said. "You wouldn't have been the first." "I'm finished," Stanley said, putting his blood-spotted cap back on his head. "All right," said Mr. Podolsky, raising his hand for a high five, but Stanley ignored it. He didn't even have the strength. Mr. Podolsky lowered his hand and looked down at Stanley's hole. "Well done," he said. "You want to ride back?" Stanley shook his head. "I'll walk." Mr. Podolsky climbed back into the truck without filling Stanley's canteen. Stanley waited for him to drive away, then took another look at his hole. He knew it was nothing to be proud of, but he felt proud nonetheless. He sucked up his last bit of saliva and spat. So just kind of try to picture how Stanley's feeling at this point in the story. I'm also going to read chapter 8 because it's really short. A lot of people don't believe in curses. A lot of people don't believe in yellow spotted lizards either. But if one bites you, it doesn't make a difference whether you believe in it or not. Actually, it is kind of odd that scientists named the lizard after its yellow spots. Each lizard has exactly 11 yellow spots, but the spots are hard to see on its yellow-green body. The lizard is from 6 to 10 inches long and it has big red eyes. In truth, its eyes are yellow, but in its skin around the eyes, which is red, but everyone always speaks of its red eyes. It also has black teeth and a milky white tongue. Looking at one, you would have thought that it should have been named a red-eyed lizard or a black-toothed lizard or perhaps a white-tongued lizard. If you've ever been close enough to see the yellow spots, you're probably dead. The yellow spotted lizards like to live in holes which offer shade from the sun and protection from predatory birds. Up to 20 lizards may live in one hole. They have strong, powerful legs, and you can leap out of very deep holes to attack their prey. They eat small animals, insects, certain cactus thorns, and the shells of sunflower seeds.